Hi everyone, welcome back to Art History 2. This week, I actually wrote out a little transcript for myself so that I could help keep myself on track a little bit more. So if you see me looking off to the side, that's why I'm looking over at my screen so I can read off some of the text that I wrote out for myself. This week, we move into the 19th century and look at how European colonial expansion and revolution impacted the Romantic movement in art. We'll also take a look at Japanese printmaking and what are called ukiyo-e prints, like the Great Wave by Hokusai that we see on the screen. Some of the questions to consider this week. First, how and why do certain figures come to symbolize power, ideals of freedom, and revolution? How and why are foreign, quote-unquote, people or cultures depicted as exotic and or submissive? What is the role of art in perpetuating stereotypes? What's the role of nature in Romanticism and Japanese ukiyo-e prints? Some terms to know and use. Romanticism, Orientalism, French revolutions of 1830 and 1848, the Sublime, ukiyo-e, and woodblock print. All right, so let's start looking at some examples from the movement known as Romanticism. So first of all, I want to stress Romanticism is not, I repeat, not about romantic love. So let me just get that out of the way. That's a common misunderstanding. With its emphasis on the imagination and emotion, Romanticism emerged as a response to the disillusionment with the Enlightenment values of reason and order. As we know, some things make us question all logic, things like tragedy and loss. Now, in 1807, Napoleon, bent on conquering the world, brought Spain's King Charles IV into alliance with him in order to conquer Portugal. Napoleon's troops poured into Spain, supposedly just passing through, but Napoleon's real intentions soon became clear. The alliance was a trick, and the French were actually taking over. Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, was the new king of Spain. Here we're looking at Francisco Goya's The 3rd of May and he's depicting that takeover of Napoleon's French army. Hundreds of Spaniards rebelled, and on May 3rd, 1808, Spanish freedom fighters were rounded up and massacred by the French, and that's what we see depicted here in this gruesome scene. One of the other characteristics of a romantic painting is the way that the paint is laid onto the canvas. Viewed as a means of making the presence of the artist's thoughts and emotions apparent, romantic paintings are often characterized by loose, flowing brushstrokes, what we see here in the hair, the shirt, and the background of this figure. This approach to art reflected the romantic emphasis on unregulated passions. So the brushwork reflects the emotional content. That's what Charles Baudelaire, a romantic poet, once wrote. That romanticism is precisely situated neither in choice of subject nor in exact truth, but in a way of feeling. Goya's painting has also been lauded for the way that he incorporated Christian iconography. The central figure that we see here wearing white, who's clearly a poor laborer, takes the place of the crucified Christ, in effect. He's sacrificing himself for the good of his nation, or the good of his people. If we look closely at his right hand, we might see signs of the stigmata, referencing the marks that were made on Christ's body during the crucifixion. This notion of sacrifice conjures the image of the martyr, so that's someone who dies for their beliefs. If we compare it to the heroic neoclassical scene by Jacques-Louis David, both are heroic, but one is a kind of like a cool, didactic, or in other words, a teaching kind of representation, showing us civic sacrifice. The other, on the left, is more of horror and desperation and fear. One shows the bloody reality of war on the left, and the other idealizes it, where there's no bloodshed on the right. This martyr-like imagery can be seen in contemporary images too. We could compare Goya's painting to the 2016 photograph of Aisha Evans being arrested at a Black Lives Matter protest in Baton Rouge in the wake of Alton Sterling's murder at the hands of police, for example. The previous example by Goya, like this example from Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, show a disillusionment or a distrust with Enlightenment era reason. These artists draw from the imagination in some ways, exaggerating certain forms rather than showing a classical ideal. It's often brought up, for example, in this painting that the woman's anatomy is kind of off, like she has a few extra vertebrae that don't exist, just to elongate her back and her spine. So she looks kind of unnatural, actually, through that kind of exaggeration rather than portraying a classical ideal. Another popular subject of Romanticism is a focus on exoticism or otherness. I brought up that term Orientalism earlier. That's the West's patronizing perceptions and fictional depictions of the quote-unquote East. In other words, the people who inhabit the places of Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. In this example, we see Ingres' sinuous odalisque reflects this kind of contemporary fascination with this exotic notion of the harem, although it's a completely purely imagined image of a harem because he had never traveled. We got the peacock fan, the turban, the enormous pearls, the hookah, and of course the title of the painting. They all refer to the French idea of the quote-unquote Orient. And I just want to be careful about that word Orient. It doesn't really mean the Far East in this case. It means more so North Africa. This is something that the post-colonialist theorist Edward Said wrote about in his book on the subject, Orientalism. On the cover of the book is the painting The Snake Charmer and His Audience, a painting by French artist Jean-Léon Gérôme, which depicts a naked boy holding a snake, while an older man plays the flute. Gérôme has created this scene totally out of his imagination as well, but he's using this really highly refined, realistic kind of style to suggest that he had actually been there in person when in fact he had not. So in doing so, he makes it seem like public nudity was the norm in the so-called Orient. It's no coincidence that many of these Orientalist paintings of the Middle East and North Africa came from French artists. In 1789, a French army led by Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt and occupied the country until 1801. In 1809, the French government started publishing books illustrating the topography, architecture, monuments, natural life, and people of Egypt. These books were an influential document of the culture of this region for artists back in Europe. However, they also produced damaging and enduring stereotypes of the people of North Africa. In 1832, the French artist Eugène Delacroix journeyed to Morocco, and his trip to North Africa prompted other artists to follow. Delacroix's painting reflected the Romantic artist's fascination with the quote-unquote Orient and was considered incredibly authentic. But I got a few questions. So first of all, where are the children? Why are the women just sitting on the floor, kind of lounging around? These depictions are stereotypes which make the women look more like prostitutes in a brothel than mothers in their own home. Keep in mind that at this time, we also have the advent of photography. But even though we might think about a photograph as being totally objective, documentary evidence, these were just as constructed and based on racist stereotypes as the paintings were. This is a tactic often used to make quote-unquote foreigners, enemies, and colonized people the other, the outsider, to make them appear less than, even dehumanize them. It makes it easier to rationalize inhumane behavior towards those people as well. Romantic artists also created artworks that reflected contemporary politics and events. And with violent revolutions in France in 1830 and 1848, there was plenty of material to draw from. Here, Delacroix is depicting an event from the July Revolution of 1830, an event that replaced King Charles X with Louis Philippe I, who was called the Citizen King. Makes it seem like he's really a king for the people. What do you notice first about this painting? So even though there's tons of people in the scene, people from all different economic levels and ages joining the revolution, my eye tends to go right to the female figure. Her dress is falling down, she's holding some sort of weapon in an arm. In her other arm, she's got the French flag. She's kind of Hot mess. She wears a Roman style hat. I don't know if you can see that. It kind of looks just like her hair, but she's in fact wearing a cap. And this was a hat that was worn by freed slaves in ancient Rome. So she becomes what we call an allegorical figure. In other words, a person who symbolizes an abstract idea. In this case, she represents liberty, hence the title of the painting. She becomes a figure who is symbolic of a movement. Romantic artists also depicted scenes of nature, but not just any old nature. We're talking the sublime. Edmund Burke's Philosophical Enquiry, which was published in 1757, connected the sublime with experiences of awe, terror, and danger. Burke saw nature as the most sublime object, capable of generating the strongest sensations in its beholders. This romantic conception of the sublime proved influential for several generations of artists, like the German artist Caspar David Friedrich. Friedrich paints a seascape, but most of what we can see here is actually the sky, not the sea. The monk, can you see him down here? He's barely visible. He's just this tiny little blip on the horizon. The sea overwhelms the man who's standing at the shore, as if he's looking out into an abyss. Friedrich arranged the composition as if to communicate an emotional response to nature. As he put it, a painter should paint not only what he sees before him, but also what he sees within himself. So to review, some of the characteristics of romantic painting include privileging passion and emotion over reason and logic, the exotic world of the Orient, contemporary politics, and the sublime of nature. Okay, meanwhile in Japan, ukiyo-e artists were depicting scenes inspired by kabuki theater and entertainers of the pleasure districts. This was also known as the pictures of the floating world, a genre of Japanese art that flourished in Japan from the 17th through the 19th centuries. Many indulged in the entertainments of kabuki theater, courtesans, and geishas of the pleasure districts. And the term ukiyo, actually just on its own, ukiyo, came to describe that lifestyle. The E added on at the end refers to images. So this is a ukiyo-e woodblock print by Japanese artist Utagawa Kuniyoshi. And in the image, the princess recites a spell that summons a giant skeleton. This is one of my favorite ukiyo-e prints. But this one is probably the most famous. These prints were made using the woodblock printing technique, which is when an image is made by carving a block of wood, inking the wood, and then pressing it onto a piece of paper. I'd like to check out this video that shows a little bit of that process. The artist Hokusai moved away from the tradition of making images of courtesans and actors, which was really the customary subject of ukiyo-e prints. Instead, his work focuses on images of daily life and nature, like we see here. I'm not sure if you noticed this, but we also have boats. There's a boat here, people in these boats underneath this massive wave. So how would you compare Hokusai's print on the right to Caspar David Friedrich's painting on the left? Would you consider Hokusai's print also an example of the sublime? All right, so that's it for this week. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and ask anything about the upcoming assignments and that sort of thing. Otherwise, I'll see you next week where we discuss 1850 to 1900.